Shatter Sanders was publicly ridiculed for a single visible outburst. Dillon Gabriel, heralded for keeping cool, ended up in a worse PR storm, not because of anything explosive, but because of a leaked clip that stripped away the illusion. The irony cuts deep. The moment Gabriel finally shows fire, it becomes a weapon against him. That's the paradox Cleveland quarterbacks face.
If you're into the real story and all the messy twists they don't show on highlight reels, go ahead and subscribe. And if you're sticking around to see how this Browns QB chaos plays out, you should definitely be subscribed.
If you show emotion, you're unstable. If you don't, you're not a leader. Sanders' image improved after being demonized. Gabriel's crumbled under the same microscope that once praised him. It's not just media hypocrisy, it's systemic dysfunction. Cleveland doesn't develop quarterbacks, it devours them. The local press fuels a machine that thrives on reinvention and reversal. Sanders and Gabriel are merely symbols of a deeper issue. Leadership voids, shifting blame, and a franchise that confuses narrative with progress. The problem isn't what these players did. It's how Cleveland refuses to let them grow without first tearing them down. Dillon Gabriel was supposed to be the calm in the storm. The level-headed, no-drama quarterback who would bring stability to a franchise that hasn't known peace in decades. That's how he was sold. Not just by the team, but by the media who anointed him as the next safe choice before he'd even thrown a meaningful pass. And for a while, that image held, until it didn't. The moment that Mike Tupp clip leaked, everything unraveled. It wasn't even that dramatic. Gabriel showed visible frustration, exchanged sharp words with teammates. Nothing out of the ordinary in a high-pressure environment. But the second that clip hit social media, the whole narrative flipped. Suddenly, this calm leader was being framed as rattled, overwhelmed, maybe even emotionally unstable. And just like that, the same media who had been protecting him turned him into a scapegoat. This wasn't just a one-off. It was the latest chapter in a long-running, deeply broken pattern in Cleveland's football culture. One that doesn't just eat its young, but scripts their rise and fall before they even get a fair chance. Gabriel was only the latest name caught in the crossfire. And the contrast with Shatter Sanders could not have been more glaring. From the start, Sanders was cast as the antagonist. Not because of poor performance. Not because of any legitimate scandal. But because he didn't fit the mold the media wanted. He was too outspoken, too flashy, too confident. So they painted him as arrogant, undisciplined, problematic. Sanders was criticized for everything from sideline expressions to social media posts. He was dissected for minor missteps and talked about like a risk the franchise shouldn't have taken. But then something shifted. A moment of supposed attitude caught on camera turned out to be nothing more than frustration over miscommunication. And once the full context came out, Sanders was suddenly being reframed as focused, passionate, even mature. Funny how that works. The double standard couldn't be more obvious. Gabriel, who struggled on the field with missed throws and inconsistent execution, was insulated for weeks. His poor performances were brushed off as rookie growing pains. Meanwhile, Sanders had to fight just to be seen as credible, even when he was putting in the work and showing leadership behind the scenes. The local media played a huge role in creating this imbalance. They didn't just report the story. They manufactured it. They chose who would be the hero and who would be the problem long before either had a fair chance to define themselves. And the timing wasn't random. It was strategic. Because in a city where hope sells tickets and conflict drives ratings, narratives aren't about accuracy. They're about drama. That's the real engine behind this mess. Cleveland's media doesn't just cover the franchise. They're embedded in it. Their coverage shapes fan perception, which shapes organizational pressure, which shapes decisions. It's a self-feeding loop that turns minor incidents into full-blown controversies and sets players up for failure before the season's even halfway done. The leaked Gabriel clip became a perfect case study. It wasn't a scandal. It was a human moment. But Cleveland doesn't allow those. The media blew it up because they'd built him up too far. When reality didn't match the narrative, they didn't correct it, they flipped it. Because it's never about getting it right. It's about staying ahead of public sentiment. And public sentiment? That's just as volatile. Gabriel went from being praised for his quiet confidence to being mocked for his silence. From being admired for his unshakable composure to being ridiculed for showing emotion. The same personality traits that were once celebrated were suddenly turned against him because the story had to change. And Sanders, the player Cleveland supposedly couldn't trust, was now the one showing poise. The one taking accountability. The one holding teammates together. But no one in the media admitted they got it wrong. They just rewrote the script and moved on. This isn't about who's the better quarterback. It's about the system that keeps eating both of them alive. Every year, Cleveland starts with a new face of the franchise. A fresh quarterback. A new campaign of hope. And every year, by mid-season, the cracks start to show. The team underperforms. The media starts digging. A leaked clip, a poorly phrased quote, a sideline disagreement. Something always becomes a spark. And once that fire starts, it spreads fast. The blame always lands on someone easy to target. Usually the quarterback. Rarely the coaching staff. Almost never the front office. And the media? They act like observers instead of participants, even though they've been steering the conversation the whole time. It's not just unfair. It's destructive. Players in Cleveland aren't just playing football. They're walking a tightrope. Every interaction, every reaction, every facial expression becomes part of their public identity. And the second that identity slips out of alignment with the narrative, they're out. Gabriel was supposed to be the one who avoided all that. The measured one. The guy who didn't give the media anything to twist. But in Cleveland, that doesn't matter. Eventually, the storm finds you. And when it does, there's no protection. Not from the organization. Not from the fans. Not from the media that built you up. That's what makes this whole situation so bleak. Because the problem isn't talent. It's not a lack of effort. It's a culture that punishes vulnerability, ignores context, and demands perfection from players while offering none from leadership. And leadership is where this dysfunction starts. The Browns have cycled through coaches, coordinators, and quarterbacks more than most franchises cycle through game plans. And it's not because every one of those people failed. It's because no one is given the time or structure to succeed. You can't build a successful football program on chaos. You can't develop players in an environment that prioritizes spin over support. And you definitely can't win when your internal issues keep getting played out through viral moments and public perception. The real issue isn't that Gabriel got caught on camera showing frustration. The issue is that the clip became more important than his actual performance. That it defined him in the eyes of fans and media more than film study or post-game stats ever could. That's the toxic part. Because in Cleveland, image is everything until it isn't. Until the moment you no longer fit the story the city wants to tell. And what's tragic is that the fans still believe. Even after years of heartbreak, even after countless false starts, they still cling to hope. Still think this year might finally be different. But that belief is exactly what the media and organization weaponize. It's what keeps the cycle going. Sell the dream, blame the player, reset. It's never just about football. It's about control. And until someone in that building finally says, enough, until someone stops letting public perception dictate player development, nothing will change. Not with Gabriel. Not with Sanders. Not with the next quarterback or the one after that. So now here we are again. One quarterback humiliated. Another suddenly redeemed. A fan base confused. A locker room under pressure. And a media machine already scanning for the next headline. If you're exhausted by this cycle, hit that like button. Drop a comment. Who's really at fault here and what needs to change first? And if you're into deep dives that pull back the curtain on the mess behind the mic, subscribe. Because in Cleveland, the more things change, the more they stay dysfunctional. You know what makes this all even more maddening? No one ever admits they played a part in it. Not the media who fueled the fire. Not the talking heads who flipped their takes. Not the organization that sat silently while their players were dragged online and picked apart on every radio segment and tweet thread. No one stands up and says, we mishandled this. We contributed to the mess. They just keep marching forward, pretending like it's business as usual, while another quarterback gets shredded through the same broken machinery. That's what happened to Dillon Gabriel. He walked into a narrative that was never built for him to succeed. At best, he was a placeholder. Someone the franchise could spin as mature, polished, coachable. Someone they could market as the anti-headline, the non-controversial QB in a city that's been traumatized by headlines. But the second he showed an ounce of stress, that story flipped. Not gradually, instantly. One leaked moment, one clip, and everything they'd built him up to be collapsed under the weight of expectations they placed on him in the first place. The city of Cleveland is desperate for a hero, and that desperation is the trap, because it forces them to write redemption stories before there's anything to redeem, to crown saviors before they've even earned a regular season win. It creates this fragile pedestal, too high to survive reality. And once reality hits, the fall is brutal, public, overanalyzed to death. And meanwhile, what's happening behind the scenes? Shatter Sanders, the player the media was all too eager to criticize, is quietly earning back respect. Not because he suddenly changed, but because the narrative shifted. The same traits that got him labeled as arrogant are now being rebranded as confident. His sideline intensity? Now it's competitive fire. His frustration? Leadership. His past criticisms? Shrugged off as growing pains. None of it was about actual growth. It was just about timing. That's the most twisted part of all this. Players aren't judged by their ability to improve. They're judged by when the media decides to tell a different story. And in Cleveland, those stories change not based on facts, but based on whatever drives the most clicks or saves the team from having to answer real questions. Because the truth? That's way more uncomfortable. The truth is that Cleveland's leadership, from the top down, has no long-term plan. They're not building toward something. They're just reacting. Reacting to fans. Reacting to the media. Reacting to pressure. Every quarterback that comes through the door is treated like an emergency patch job rather than a real investment. A short-term fix instead of a long-term foundation. And when you build around short-term fixes, you get long-term chaos. The Gabriel clip wasn't a breakdown. It was a cry for structure. A reaction from a young quarterback in a system that keeps throwing players into high-pressure roles with no safety net. It wasn't scandal, it was human. And that it became the story, that it eclipsed everything else happening on the field, just shows how far gone the entire media environment around this team really is. It's all about spin, not solutions. And because of that, nothing improves. Players come and go. Coaches rotate in and out. Strategies get rewritten every offseason. But the dysfunction? That stays. Because no one in a position of power wants to confront how much damage this culture actually does. How it stunts development. How it erodes trust. How it turns promising players into public punching bags the second things get tough. Gabriel isn't the first. He won't be the last. But he is the latest example of how Cleveland takes a manageable situation and turns it into a full-blown crisis, not because of what happens on the field, but because of how they choose to respond to it off the field. And the fan base? They've seen this story before. Over and over. They start each season cautiously optimistic, hoping that maybe this time, the new guy will be the one. The savior. The curse breaker. But by mid-season, they're exhausted. Betrayed. Left holding the same disappointment they've felt for years. And yet they still show up. Still scream in freezing stadium seats. Still wear the jersey. Because Cleveland doesn't lack loyalty. They lack leadership. That's what makes the situation with Sanders so painful in hindsight. The franchise had a chance to support him early, to recognize that his confidence wasn't a threat, that his personality wasn't a red flag. But they let the media shape the narrative. And now that it's been flipped, they want credit for his growth, as if they had anything to do with it. They didn't help him grow. They just stopped getting in his way. And Gabriel? He's now stuck where Sanders was weeks ago. Misunderstood. Overexposed. And probably realizing that no matter what he says or does from here on out, it's already too late. Once the media flips on you in Cleveland, the redemption arc doesn't come from performance. It comes from distance, from time, from eventually being quiet long enough that people forget what they thought they saw. But by then, the damage is done. And so the team resets. Another week, another narrative. Another guy elevated. Another guy torn down. And all the while, the root problems, unstable coaching, inconsistent messaging, top-down dysfunction, stay untouched. What's it going to take for Cleveland to break this cycle? Because it's clearly not just talent. They've had talent. Quarterbacks with potential. Athletes with drive. Leaders in the making. But the system eats them all the same. And the city's obsession with short-term payoff over long-term development makes real growth almost impossible. Until that changes, the only thing consistent about Cleveland football will be the emotional fatigue that comes with caring about it. The franchise can't afford to keep using its players as PR shields. They can't keep spinning every setback into a narrative twist. Not if they want to build something that lasts. They need to stop managing perception and start managing the team. Protect their players from media overreach. Create space for them to fail and learn without being crucified over one out-of-context moment. Because if they don't, there won't be a next guy who wants to be there. Players talk. Agents talk. And the league watches. And every leaked clip, every viral meltdown, every mishandled controversy becomes another warning sign to the next generation of talent. Why risk it in Cleveland when you can go to a franchise that knows how to support and develop you without turning you into content? That's the real fallout here. It's not just about Gabriel. It's about what happens next. About what message this sends to everyone watching. If you want to stop the cycle, it starts with telling the truth. The truth about how this all happened. The truth about why it keeps happening. And the truth about what needs to change. Because without that, it's just a matter of time before this whole thing repeats itself, with a new face, a new leak, and the same predictable heartbreak. Let's just say what everyone's thinking. Dillon Gabriel never stood a chance. Not really. From the second he stepped into Cleveland, he was placed on a pedestal that didn't belong to him. He didn't ask to be called the steady hand or the mature leader. He didn't script the glowing headlines or the cautious optimism that was force-fed to fans. That was all the product of a city trying to will itself into believing they'd finally found someone safe. Someone who wouldn't cause waves. But what Cleveland fails to understand year after year is that safe doesn't win championships. And narratives don't win games. The truth is, Gabriel became a character in a story already halfway written. He was supposed to be the quiet answer to a loud problem. The media framed him as the opposite of Shatter Sanders. Where Sanders had attitude, Gabriel had humility. Where Sanders was flashy, Gabriel was focused. That contrast wasn't an accident. It was a manufactured rivalry, designed to generate buzz and clicks long before either player had a real opportunity to prove themselves on the field. And that's where it all went wrong. Because when you build a narrative instead of a football team, you set everyone up to fail. Gabriel didn't fall short of expectations. The expectations were never fair. They were inflated by a media machine desperate to simplify a complex situation into a headline battle of good guy versus wild card. Then came the viral clip. One sideline moment. Gabriel frustrated, animated, clearly feeling the heat of a team spiraling. That's it. Not a tantrum. Not a meltdown. But in a city like Cleveland, that was enough. That short, stripped of context clip turned into a referendum on his entire personality. Suddenly, the quarterback who was supposed to be immune to drama was the drama. And the media pounced. The very same outlets that had boosted him all off-season flipped their tone without missing a beat. Overnight, the level-headed leader became mentally fragile. The guy who was once praised for not saying too much was now being called out for not saying enough. The whiplash? Classic Cleveland. And while that media storm was tearing Gabriel down, it was building Sanders up. Not because the media had seen the light. Not because they'd realized they'd unfairly judged him. But because they needed a new protagonist, now that the previous one had cracked under pressure. Suddenly, Sanders' previous moments of frustration weren't signs of ego. They were reframed as passion. His confidence was no longer a liability, it was leadership. And just like that, the script flipped. Again. That's how unstable the quarterback culture in Cleveland is. It's not about performance. It's about perception. About timing. About who fits the storyline better on any given week. And in the middle of all this, a locker room trying to hold itself together, a coaching staff walking on eggshells, and two quarterbacks who are likely both fed up with being used as symbols instead of treated as players. Because the issue isn't Dillon Gabriel versus Shatter Sanders. It never was. The real issue is a franchise that keeps mistaking press conferences for progress. A front office more interested in optics than outcomes. And a local media ecosystem that fuels chaos under the guise of passionate coverage. When in reality, it's just narrative exploitation, recycled year after year. You could swap out Gabriel and Sanders for any two names from the last 20 years, and the result would be the same. Cleveland doesn't know how to develop quarterbacks because it doesn't give them the space to actually grow. It builds them up too quickly, tears them down too soon, and never allows for a middle ground. What's supposed to be a journey becomes a PR war zone. And yet, somehow, the fans are still here, still hoping. Still buying jerseys and clinging to post-game hope like it's the last piece of dignity this team hasn't taken from them. It's loyalty at its most irrational, and also its most admirable. But blind hope without accountability? That's what's kept this cycle going for so long. The franchise doesn't fear failure. It expects it, so long as it comes wrapped in a marketable story. That's why every leaked moment, every viral soundbite, every quarterback quote becomes a media event instead of a minor moment. Because drama is easier to manage than discipline. A juicy controversy is easier to spin than a losing streak. And now, with Gabriel being dragged through the mud and Sanders suddenly being praised for the same things he was mocked for, you have to ask, how long until this version of the story falls apart too? Because it will. It always does. Until Cleveland stops confusing narrative control with team control, it's going to keep collapsing under the weight of its own expectations. If you're over the storylines and just want to see this franchise act like a real team for once, hit that like button. Drop a comment with your take. Was Gabriel ever given a real shot, or was he just set up to fail from day one? And if you're here for the raw, unfiltered truth behind sports drama and media spin, make sure you're subscribed. Because in Cleveland, the circus never leaves town. It just changes ringmasters.